Now folks, it's time for our keynote lecture, and it is my great pleasure to invite John Bowman to deliver it. John is a broadcaster and a historian, and he has presented current affairs, historical and election results programmes on RTE radio and television since the 1960s. He chaired the audience participation programme Questions and Answers for 21 years. He is author of De Valera, the Ulster Question, 1917 to 1973, which won the Ewart Biggs Memorial Prize for works which contribute most to peace and understanding between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and between Britain and Ireland. He has for many years written for the Irish Times each January on Irish-Anglo relations, as reflected in the release of Irish State Papers under the 30-year rule. He is also the author of Window and Mirror, RTE Television 1961 to 2011, the first comprehensive history of Irish television. His most recent book is Ireland, the Autobiography, an anthology of eyewitness accounts of Ireland since 1916. He was elected an Honorary Fellow of Trinity College Dublin in 2009 and awarded an Honorary Doctorate by UCD in 2010. He was President of the Irish Association for Cultural, Economic and Social Relations from 1993 to 1995. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Bowman to the stage.
Thank you very much, and indeed I should add, persuaded by Una to be President of the Irish Association at that time. First of all, I wish to thank those who've invited me to give this first Una O'Higgins O'Malley lecture. It is an honour, and I've decided to speak on a topic which I'm sure would have interested her, and I hope the general spirit of my paper would be addendum with her outlook. Because I've decided that the title, Brexit, Lloyd George and the Ulster Question, will become clearer as I proceed. I speak from an increasing disquiet about the political fallout from the vote of the UK electorate by 52% to 48% in favour of Brexit, and disquiet that the 56% support in the North to remain was trumped by the UK vote. And this disquiet is in contrast to a general sense of optimism which followed the approval in 1998 by voters throughout the island of Ireland by 85%, that was the total all-Ireland figure, to 15% of the terms of the Good Friday and Belfast Agreement. And moreover, that this was an endorsement of a known, widely discussed cluster of checks and balances compared to a little debated and quite unknown Brexit outcome. I recall an invitation from a newspaper in December 1999, the millennium's just coming up, inviting me to name the most important year in the 1,000 years of Irish history leading up to December the 31st, 1999. The second millennium, that was from Battle of Clontarf up to late last night. Which was the most important year? My response was that I didn't know, and I didn't believe that my opinion on such a question could be worth very much anyway. But having avoided the chalice, the question did return to my mind overnight, and I realised that I was interested in the question, and moreover, I thought I had a plausible answer. So the following day, I returned the call to the newspaper, asked was this offer still on the table, and how many words? They said yes. How many words do they want? And I said I'd write them something in a couple of days. Now, my first belief was that any greatest point or year in Irish history would best be a moment which could be shared by a large majority of the people of Ireland. I even rephrased that to a large majority of the people who at any particular moment in that millennium were inhabiting the space which we commonly agree to call Ireland. And the wording was carefully phrased because I wanted to avoid terms such as all the Irish people, since I was aware that some of those who lived on the island at any moment in that 1,000 years might not necessarily feel that covered them. I wanted to avoid, or wouldn't necessarily feel included in the term Irish people. And since Ireland as an island is a discrete geographical space, I wanted to imagine it as a community, as a population, at some point in that 1,000 years. And the year I chose for the greatest moment was 1998, very close to late last night, as it were. And before explaining why, let me go back to the 1918 election, which is just 100 years ago from now. was happening just in late November 1918 after the war, and was generally regarded as historic, coming as it did in the immediate aftermath of the Great War. In Ireland, it was widely expected that the rising Sinn Féin party would capture most of the nationalist vote, and this at the expense of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Both had indeed come together on the one platform in the earlier part of that year, while the war was still on, to oppose conscription, which Lloyd George wanted to introduce in Ireland. That the Roman Catholic hierarchy had joined that anti-conscription platform was helpful in further legitimising Sinn Féin's claim to speak for nationalist Ireland. And Sinn Féin had declared that it was using this Westminster election, the idea was originally one from Arthur Griffith, using it by standing on an abstentionist ticket and refusing to go to Westminster. Instead, they would assemble in Dublin as the first Dáil and declare an independent Ireland seeking international support. And this strategy worked. This 1918 election transformed Irish politics and introduced a new generation of Irish politicians, then all representing Sinn Féin. The generational shift is captured by the listing of names of 1918 winners who would dominate Irish politics for decades to come. Some few were confirming recent by-election victories, but most were becoming politicians, elected politicians, for the first time. And winners in that 1918 election included Eamon de Valera, W.T. Cosgrave, Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith, James Ryan, Sean McEntee, Sean T. O'Kelly, Ernest Blythe, Desmond Fitzgerald, Kevin O'Higgins. The big loser was the recently appointed leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Dillon, who lost in Mayo East to Eamon de Valera. De Valera stood in a number of constituencies, and de Valera in East Mayo won twice as many votes as Dillon. These big names would, of course, in time, split from that Sinn Féin to form Cumann Nail, now Fine Gael, when accepted the treaty, and in 1926 de Valera would take another significant group from that original Sinn Féin party to found Fianna Fáil, leaving a rump of the original Sinn Féin behind as continuing abstentionists. But back to the 1918 election. In terms of the overall seats won, 1918 was a Sinn Féin landslide. Throughout the island of Ireland, Sinn Féin won 73 seats, to the Unionists 26, with the old Irish party reduced to a rump of 6. As de Valera would soon put it, in America, no people on earth ever agreed so overwhelmingly on a great issue. Yet, were there not 2 landslides in the 1918 election? Taking those 6 northeastern counties, soon to become, within a year or so, to become Northern Ireland, here are the figures. Of the 29 seats of the 6 counties, Sinn Féin had won 3 of the 29. The Irish Party won 4, Nationalists and others had 7, and the Unionists won 22 of the 29. Was this not an equivalent landslide? Now, in fairness to the nationalist elite of that period, it should be emphasised that they were engaged in an ongoing military and political struggle to win independence, and propaganda was an essential part of that. It was not an atmosphere conducive to reminding people of any strength in your opponent's case. And it should also be emphasised that most other expressions of nationalism elsewhere did not have the very special challenge which remains with us of coveting so much hostile territory and well beyond the natural geographical base, as was the case with Irish nationalism. This is because most of the world's nationalisms are landlocked and can make some pragmatic accommodation to agree to their boundaries. Ireland was different, remains different. As Arthur Griffith put it, Ireland cannot shift her frontiers. The Almighty traced them beyond the cunning of man to modify. But the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, seeking a solution to the Irish question, could see in these 1918 election figures 2 landslides and a plausible case for some partitioning of Ireland. And moreover, this was a challenge and a field of forces quite suited to Lloyd George's negotiating skills. Now, if I'd known there was a video here, I would have put this up on video, but you can possibly, some of you, see this. This is a cartoon of March 1920, and it is Lloyd George as a conjurer. You see the rabbit in the hat, or at least there's no rabbit in the hat, but this is from Punch. It's called The Kindest Cut of All. And Lloyd George was a conjurer, was often depicted as a conjurer in cartoons. He did not much care about the merits or details of a negotiation as long as he could get what we now know as a result. In this case, Lord George is depicted as the conjurer, shows his audience the map of Ireland with the province of Ulster marked and ready to be cut out of the map with Lloyd George's scissors. The conjurer's top hat is on the table, and the caption calls Lloyd George the Welsh wizard. I now proceed to cut this map into 2 parts and place them in the hat. After a suitable interval, they will be found to have come together of their own accord. Then, as an aside, at least let's hope so, I've never done this trick before. Lloyd George would have been amused had he thought that the line on the Irish map, which he brought forward in 1920, would now, in the Government of Ireland Act, would now be the subject of a backstop in the Brexit talks. But it is his line, and it's important to appreciate just how casually it was chosen. In Lloyd George's voluminous papers, there is an aside at the Versailles Peace Conference, as he was poring over the maps of Europe in search of various accommodations and the redrawing of boundaries and carving out new nation states. He allowed that he had seen, quote, he had seen a lot of little Ulsters on the maps across Europe. And of course he had. There were so many examples of the Irish case. The Irish problem was the jackpot looked available, looked plausible. The jackpot was the 32 counties, the whole island, because, as Griffith put it, the Almighty had determined the boundaries. 30 years ago, when I was writing a book, De Valera and the Ulster Question, I wrote that Lloyd George enjoyed a legendary reputation in Ireland for negotiating genius and duplicity, both deserved. And everything I've read since reinforces this portrait. President Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, with first-hand experience of Lloyd George's style at Versailles, writes privately in his papers, now in Princeton archives, a chameleon has nothing on Lloyd George. He is about as stable as Mercury. In fact, everyone appears dazed by the whole performance. The French view, from President Clemenceau, Lloyd George is a trickster. I don't like being double-crossed. He has deceived me. From Britain, Lord Riddle's verdict was that Lloyd George was willing to scrap a theory, change tack, crafty, charming, he softens opponents, reads opponents, a born actor. And Irish verdicts. T.P. O'Connor of the Irish Parliamentary Party, with decades of dealing with Lloyd George and observing him at Westminster, reported that Lloyd George was, quote, universally regarded as an unprincipled trickster. De Valera, after one sequence of meetings in July 1921, wrote that during the treaty negotiations, later that year he was staying in Dublin, as a reserve against the tricks of Lloyd George. And Ulster Unionists did not have any higher opinion. Lady Craigavon's diary reveals that during those treaty talks, a Craig private family visit to London was ambushed by Lloyd George as they arrived at the railway station, and Craig was expected, he was on his way to Eton to meet his sons, brought him for an emergency meeting in Downing Street and sprung the proposal that Northern Ireland would be incorporated in the Irish Free State with an opt-out provision. And that's really what happened later. Lady Craigavon's diary notes that Craig became suspicious of Lloyd George's manoeuvrings, insisted that he had to have any proposals in writing, adding that her husband believed this to be essential, especially when dealing with a man like Lloyd George. And so it proved at the treaty talks. Lloyd George deployed all of these skills, his preference for one-to-one meetings, in this case with Griffith, and it was on Ulster, and we all know the story of his skill in injecting this into the negotiations at the 11th hour. Now, in that same book, De Valera and the Ulster Question, I did some research on content analysis. And this was before word search, I should add, and before optical character recognition and all the other aids to the modern researcher, which I'm now happy to use. But I do regard that old slog now with considerable, not approval, but admiration, because of the scale of going through content analysis when you just don't need to type in onto a database the words you're looking for, and word search brings up the sort of 17 examples or whatever. So I did this the old-fashioned way. But by reading through the speeches, campaign literature, interviews and policies of that first generation of post-1916 nationalists, there is a naive analysis of the Ulster Question which emerges. The fact that an optimistic nationalist might believe these ideas made them all the more powerful. They brought comfort to those who lived in hope of a united Ireland, and they won votes for those politicians who argued that partition was essentially a British problem rather than one rooted in Irish differences. And there were 6 central ideas at the heart of the nationalist analysis of partition. They may to some seem plausible, but they are, I believe, riddled with make-believe and self-deception, and they encouraged policy positions which were doomed to fail. Nationalists in 1920 embraced the following propositions: that all of the people who lived on the island of Ireland comprised one nation, the Irish nation. That Ireland had been partitioned by Britain with one motive, British self-interest. That this was a sufficient explanation for partition. That Ireland would be united one day, that this was geographically predetermined, irrespective of nationalist behaviour. That that day would come sooner if only Britain could bring herself to use her military, political and economic resources to deliver it. That Britain had those resources available and had the capacity to deliver a united Ireland and a stable Ireland. And finally, that Ulster Unionism's fallback position, if the British withdrew, would be to plead for entry terms to a united Ireland rather than attempt to set up any independent state of their own. As I say, this was based on content analysis of all the speeches, statements, interviews, etc., many hundreds of them, of Sinn Féin elite talking about the partition of Ireland in the 1916 to 21 period. These are so kind of central, I'll just go through them quickly again, that all the people who lived in the island were Irish, that partition was, total explanation was British self-interest, that Ireland would be united if we just waited around no matter what we did, that Britain could hasten that day by coercing the Unionists to find themselves in United Ireland, and they had the resources to do that, and the Unionist second option would be to plead for terms. Now this analysis, when it was published in 1982 in the book, was not contested by broadly Irish nationalists or other historians. There was at that time a sense of recognition, I think, by those interested in this issue, that this had been the sufficient analysis for many decades, the core beliefs of Irish nationalists about partition. It won considerable approval. Then I noticed that the British liked this analysis too, very fond of it. Enoch Powell gave the book a very good review, waved it around in the House of Commons. And I then later saw in Margaret Thatcher's papers that Alan Goodison, who was the incoming British ambassador, listed out these exact 6 myths in his introductory briefing on Ireland to Geoffrey Howe, the Foreign Secretary, who passed them on to Thatcher, who marked the passages. And I had to begin examining my conscience as to whether I was facilitating or whatever. But as they were honestly formulated, I said, that's somebody else's issue, not mine. The pervading Irish complacency that it would be all right on the night was what drove anti-partitionism for many, many decades. These views were mainstream, I'd say, until about 1970. And it was speeches based on this analysis which set the rafters ringing for nationalist politicians. This was their politically correct analysis. Heretical voices were unpopular, hence rare. But such a superficial, incomplete, half-baked analysis inhibited, in my view, any possibility of moving towards a policy which might have some chance of success. And encouraging this naive analysis was the seductively attractive theory of national self-determination, which was the politically correct prescription for nationalists in the aftermath of the Great War. And Irish Republicans cited all island self-determination as it provided the key to a resolution of the Irish question. Lloyd George, on the other hand, believed that partition was at least a temporary necessity, and earned the applause of many subsequent British historians for using this expedient to solve the Irish question, whereas he had really settled it rather than solved it. Yet even those who accepted that some form of partition was a temporary necessity must admit that the line as agreed by Lord George was crude. After the treaty, the new government in Dublin and Belfast quickly proceeded to adopt a siege mentality, closing themselves off from each other. And nationalism failed then to produce a politics which in style, content or prescription could unite the island of Ireland. To be fair to that generation of nationalists, there was a lot to complain about. There was the deep sense of grievance about partition itself, compounded by the fact that the border as drawn was deeply unfair to many border nationalists, and this was further exacerbated by the treatment of northern nationalists within Northern Ireland. Yet it is possible to hold all of these views, that partition was painful, the chosen border was unfair, and that northern nationalists suffered discrimination, and still reluctantly accept the proposition that in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, some form of partition was inevitable as at least a temporary necessity. Now, we need to come up much closer to modern times because there's a limit on the duration of this lecture. But that was the sort of background, and that flourished for a long time. It was another generation of politicians, and it was the aftermath of the Troubles which changed everything. And particularly John Hume, as somebody who nurtured the notion of an agreed Ireland to replace the old goal of a united Ireland. That marks him off, I think, as one of the leading Irish nationalists of the second half of the 20th century. And this shift was seismic. It opened the gateway to the historic accommodation between nationalism and unionism, placing the emphasis on people, not territory, and on Hume's idea that such an agreed Ireland should be endorsed by the voters north and south on the one day. And this undermined at a stroke any claims that a resort to physical force might be justified. And the physical force had been justified throughout that period in all its comings and goings on the basis of the 1918 election, which, as I tried to show, was much more complicated than a landslide for the 1918 Sinn Féin. The culmination of Hume's career was the Belfast Agreement signed on Good Friday in 1998, but it was the endorsement of that agreement, so overwhelmingly by the people north and south, which gave it its historic importance. I remember doing the television coverage of that night, and I was totally focused on this idea of how has Ireland voted, not how has the North. I'd helped to design an exit poll. There were 6 variables. My son Iveagh, who was more mathematically gifted than myself, but anyway, I worked out a sort of formula. There were 6 variables. There was the proportionate size of 2 electorates in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. There was the proportionate turnouts, and then there was the 2 exit polls. And I had all these figures, and I put the figures in, and I said 80. So I looked at the camera and said 85% of the people of Ireland have voted for the Good Friday Agreement. And that proved to be absolutely correct. That's how it turned out. The 71% in the north, it was almost 95% in the south, and it is 85% in the island of Ireland. And that was, John Hume had spoken about this many times, that they wanted to get that vote on the one date. The 1998 vote was a plebiscite with a detailed, negotiated settlement put to the electorate. This settlement represented the greatest level of consensus which had ever been achieved between the 2 Irish traditions. 1918 was an election rather than a referendum, with many seats uncontested, and the measure of support for self-determination was a mere extrapolation of the proportion of seats won by Sinn Féin. But the 1998 vote, with its historic level of support throughout the island and among both nationalist and unionist voters, renders it the most consensual expression of political opinion in the entire history of the geographical space that we call Ireland. There is no moment in the 1,000 years before where you could say that people had ever been invited or been given that opportunity to express themselves, that they wanted to support something with all its checks and balances, with all its small detail, and well explained. And it is in the ownership of all the people of Ireland, nationalist and unionist still, and it is a very precious milestone in our shared history. And it was based on Lloyd George's line, the division between the 6 and the 26. It softened that line. It gave us a softer border than we'd ever had since that line had been drawn. It allowed for all parties to work for other goals, a united Ireland or the continuation of the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And both London and Dublin would respect this clause, and respect, facilitating and underpin any change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, if a majority ever decided to vote in a plebiscite for a united Ireland. It may also be said that whether the agreement survives in its present form or is mutated into something else, 1998 will remain that historic year in Irish history, representing a proof that the voters throughout Ireland had been on the same learning curve and had come to believe that given the complexity of our politics, we needed a complex system of checks and balances to govern ourselves. And that historic acceptance of inclusivity and equality should become part of our Irish political culture, part of the grammar of how we all throughout this island want to govern ourselves. It is nothing short of the most significant measurement of Irish political opinion of the century, of the millennium, indeed ever. And it was for that reason that I nominated the year 1998 as the most important year of the second millennium. Put simply, we made our own history. It was this arrival at such a point in the history of the island that gave ground for optimism and patience. This was a framework, a bespoke framework, suited to the peculiar field of forces which make up what we may call the Ulster question. So I've taken a great interest in this topic, and that always gave me great comfort, that there was that moment where people on both sides of the border had agreed, or in the whole island. And then comes Brexit, with its consequences. As Peter Robinson put it at the McGill Summer School this year, shaking that tree was certain to cause an abundant fallout. But it's important to pause here and note a key difference between the Brexit poll and the Belfast Agreement poll. In the Brexit poll, there was widespread confusion, propaganda and misinformation about what voters were voting for or against. There was no certainty about what a Brexit agreement would look like, and given the most recent developments, we can surely say that the consequences of their vote remain largely unknown to the voters. In contrast, as I've said, the Good Friday Agreement, the small print was all in front of the voters. It was a bespoke, sophisticated, mutual agreement exactly suited to the unique problem it was addressing, and it could bring calm to the region. It would give space for all parties to pursue their legitimate goals. And it attracted much international attention for how these matters were negotiated here and might be negotiated elsewhere. Brexit, in contrast, is highly controversial and riddled with anomalies. First, there is the complicating factor that in Northern Ireland there was a 56% support to remain, trumped only because it was a UK-wide decision. But even had the UK voted by merely 50% of the electorate plus one, the presumption was that the UK would leave the European Union. And notice how much dissatisfaction there has been, not least because different parts of the UK voted differently. Scotland, 62% remain, Northern Ireland, 56%. And while we might argue that there is a stronger case for a bespoke arrangement for Northern Ireland, and here you'd have to have sympathy for the bureaucrats in Brussels, part of the EU's headache is that whatever Northern Ireland might get, so Scotland wants. Another factor can be suggested here. I've been surprised that relatively little attention has been paid to the fact that 48% of the UK voted to remain. It is repetitively called a decisive result. But it was decisive only in the sense that the result itself was not in doubt. But it was not at all decisive in terms of the 48-52. It's quite an even break between those two. I think that has been very much under-reported in British media. Post-Brexit, it is evident that the Republic's government has an interest and a duty to minimise the damage to this island, most tellingly in insisting that there be no hard border in Ireland. How that is to be done has proved extraordinarily complex, and I think Lloyd George would be the first to be surprised by the column inches spent on his border in the past number of months across Europe. The Irish government has also to defend the right of those citizens within Northern Ireland who recognise the Irish government's role as a custodian of the Good Friday Agreement, and it must insist that many of those interests are written into the Brexit deal. It must ensure that if the provisions for a border poll were to be triggered under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement and were a majority to vote for Irish unity in such a poll, such a united Ireland would automatically become a full member of the European Union. These are only some of the requirements which the Irish government was obliged to address. That they managed to ruffle some unionist and British feathers on the way is scarcely surprising. Among the downsides of Brexit is that those who paid very little attention or no attention to the complexities which would follow in Ireland are now surprised and disappointed that there are such serious consequences. It has all demonstrated a remarkable ignorance by far too many of the players in British politics and media who really ought to know more, and indeed ought to know better. Nevertheless, we should heed Peter Robinson's warning in his McGill Summer School address that there has been a rapid deterioration in unionist estimation of the Irish government. Robinson reckons that unionists believe that, quote, Dublin has been completely self-serving and unnecessarily bellicose during the process and has given no consideration to the effect and force of their words and actions upon the unionist population. Moreover, he believes that should London-Dublin and North-South relations worsen post-Brexit, the spillover consequences on relationships within Northern Ireland are clear and alarming. Peter Robinson also referred in that paper to an inevitable loss of collegiality between the politicians and the public servants who had managed the North-South and East-West equilibrium in recent decades. Now they would find themselves inevitably as competitors rather than colleagues. And speaking as somebody who has examined in detail the complicated relationships, especially of diplomats on the Irish side and the British side, and examining those documents over many decades, I recognise the picture which Robinson paints and the further challenges facing this very hard-working and talented group of individuals whose work is often scarcely visible, but have contributed so much to keeping the potential toxicity of this field of forces in check. Among the changes in Ireland over the past half-century is a growing appreciation by all sides that we find ourselves in this together and needing one another to avoid any further excesses. In some ways, in Ireland, we have been collectively a disgrace. In this small island, the participants in the Troubles for 30 years were Christians, even church-going Christians. They were Caucasian, they were English-speaking, they were all from a relatively developed part of the world, and yet they managed to have enough mutual enmity to create 30 years of an incipient civil war. There are other places in the world with challenges much more complex who must wonder how we did it, and why we expected the world to take such notice of us. I think there is now a wider appreciation of all of this, and that the checks and balances in the Good Friday Agreement remain fragile and should not be taken for granted. The continuing absence of a power-sharing executive at Stormont is but one challenge and represents a serious democratic deficit, as is, incidentally, the lack of any nationalist representation at Westminster, though I personally understand how Sinn Féin, having made their point, decline. I think it follows that they will decline to take their seats, but it is still a serious omission then by the Northern electorate not to elect people who do take their seats. We'd all be safer the more we appreciate our interdependence, and that will be difficult to sell post-Brexit. A divergence of interests between Northern Ireland and the Republic must inevitably follow to some extent. This has been plausibly spelt out by Peter Robinson in his Glencree's paper, yet it was an answer to a question after his presentation which won all the headlines. And I think it's a measure of the lack of serious debate on the challenges which Brexit poses to us on this island that Robinson's thoughtful paper went so underreported. There's also been far too little debate on the merits of examining a bespoke deal for Northern Ireland, one which would safeguard economic interests and was coveted by some business and agricultural interests. This was a case of politics trumping economics. All attempts to interest Northern Ireland in a bespoke deal, no matter how favourable, was rejected by the DUP simpliciter. They were determined to see any such move as weakening the Union. Looking ahead, as is appropriate given how momentous the 1998 referendum was and given how historic Brexit will be for the totality of relations within these islands, it remains true that the parties, groups, communities, factions with the greatest self-interest in an agreed Ireland are the people who inhabit this island and who are destined with their descendants and any new immigrants to share it in perpetuity. And they will, I believe, reach wiser outcomes if they think in terms of maximising the consensus on a goal of an agreed Ireland. Another plus is that the term an agreed Ireland embodies its mission statement in its umbrella, in its title, and suggests a pathway towards maximising agreement whilst respecting differences. We can be agreed that we respect Northern Ireland's place within the UK, whilst also respecting the amended Article 3, granting the right to be part of the Irish nation to all those born on the island of Ireland, and expressing a desire for the peaceful political unification of the island, subject to the consent of the peoples of Northern Ireland and the Republic. Whatever we can agree on should be emphasised. Cultural policy, traditional music, its important and many links and indebtedness to the Ulster-Scotland special relationship, our railway heritage and how it has been saved in East Belfast, in the Cultra Railway Heritage Museum, and of knowing who to cheer for at Lansdowne Road when beating the All Blacks, captained by an Ulsterman, Rory Best, with a try coming from another Ulsterman, Jacob Stockdale. These are not unimportant moments. The women's hockey team, runners-up in the World Cup. And I noticed that Andy Pollock, as he said himself, he's been too long in Northern Ireland not to have worked it out, he looked at the makeup of that hockey team and discovered its very diverse roots throughout Ireland, including a captain, by the way, from Ulster, who had been a camogie player. So there's detail for you. In researching this topic on and off over a lifetime, I can remember very many things and points of reference, so I have a few additional points to add. One is Thatcher's admission in her farewell chat in 10 Downing Street with the departing Irish ambassador, Noel Dorr. She suggested to him that if those in the room just below us, that was the cabinet room, had managed to get it right in the 1921 talks, we would have an easier task. This was a clear reference to the line chosen by Lloyd George for the border. Thatcher did from time to time complain about the impossibility of the border as drawn and occasionally asked her civil servants to look at any possibility of a redrawing of the border. But she did sign, or was persuaded to sign, she later claimed that it was against her better judgment, the Hillsborough Agreement, which can be seen as essentially, this was in Gareth Fitzgerald's time, superseded of course by the Good Friday Agreement, which can be seen as essentially an acknowledgement by the British of the interdependence of both islands in seeking an amicable settlement. An understanding that we are all in a complex and potentially toxic field of forces and that cannot be solved without everybody's involvement. The essence of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1986 was also very well understood, I think, by the late Seamus Heaney, who was jealous of his independence in making any political interventions and who certainly and appropriately resisted any notion that it could be conscripted by any one side. But as his poetry shows, he is all too aware of the exceptional forces at play in Northern Ireland. And he recognised the historic significance of that Hillsborough Agreement in 1986, describing it as that subtle, symbolic knot tied by civil servants from Westminster and Dublin in an attempt to provide a new, more responsive and self-justifying mechanism for concession or complaint or suasion on either side. Heaney reckoned that what was called the spirit of the agreement seemed to require and sponsor a candid coming and going between the domains of Britishness and Irishness, allowing everyone to follow the generous inclination. It promoted equilibrium between the two governments and an abdication of the high moral ground and a recognition by Britain that the haughty fiction that the internal affairs of Northern Ireland were a matter of domestic British concern only was indeed a fiction. I think this point from Heaney is hugely important and has become relevant again post-Brexit, when so many British voices seem impatient with Irish interventions. British leaders have, as we know, sometimes suggested that Northern Ireland was as British as Finchley. Thatcher once worded it that way. Theresa May often echoes similar sentiments in the current context, but that is a context shaped by her government's dependence on DUP support. Looking to the long-term future, it seems unlikely that Lloyd George's line will survive. We can surely do better. It is difficult to believe that the EU would be satisfied with such a border indefinitely. And they are committed, as is Britain, to supporting Irish unity if a majority in Northern Ireland were to vote for it, with the Republic also supporting it. All of this makes Northern Ireland different. That precious union, as Theresa May now so often calls it, is in fact a conditional union. She has no right to say, as she has done during recent fraught Brexit interviews, that no British government could ever allow a border down the Irish Sea. All British Prime Ministers are in fact co-custodians of an international agreement which spells out scenarios where it could possibly come about that a majority in Northern Ireland would vote itself out of the UK, and the London government is solemnly bound to accept and implement any such result. But just as those who wish to use Brexit to strengthen the Union may be opportunist, that might also be said of those who think of exploiting Brexit as a quick fix for Irish unity. Brexit is likely to bring many unintended consequences for Ireland. And those who are enthusiastic about an early border poll in Northern Ireland should appreciate that although the winning post is 50% plus one vote, it is highly unlikely that there won't be strong regional variation either side of the river Bann in any border poll which is called before there is sufficient support for it. I will finish with a personal note. My first memory of the border was being brought up through a field in County Monaghan at the age of 5, when I was visiting my grandmother's farm where my mother grew up, and I was shown County Fermanagh a few fields away. I was reassured. I had somehow thought that Northern Ireland had been towed away to be linked up and stuck on to Scotland. I was further reassured when I noticed on the branch railway line from Clones to Red Hills that in its 7 miles it had crisscrossed the border 6 times, and very beautifully as well. Just each crossing is a mile distant from the next. On the map it looked as if the railway line had sewn with perfect stitching north and south together. And many years later I wondered whether it could ever have been meaningfully said that Ireland was united before the great 19th century railway pioneer William Dargan built the railway network. Surely it was Dargan who first united Ireland in any meaningful sense. How united was the territory before the railways? Had people from Belfast ever seen Kerry? Had they not much better links to Scotland? What is unity anyway? Is it not best considered as a continuum? Are we not more or less united throughout our history and into the future? Was the US one country, or Canada or Australia, before the backbone of the railway united the territory? Or to take a European example, Norway did not feel it was one country until the extraordinary engineering achievement, about a century, a little over the turn of the century, turn of the 1920s, of the Oslo to Bergen railway line. And it was independent of Sweden within a decade. So we're all here for a short visit only on this planet, and we should not be too prescriptive about the future. I don't think Lloyd George was. He was interested in a quick fix. But we may not serve ourselves well if we don't work more on respecting Ulster particularism in all its complexity, including its important west-east links to Britain, working on all of those matters which maximise mutual respect between all Irishmen and women, and perhaps managing to do all of this without believing that we will have Lloyd George's line in perpetuity. Thank you very much.